Hi, I'm Sam. I'm technically a freelance design systems and design tokens expert, but I spend most of my time right now working with the Token Studio team. I know how many of you are using Token Studio, but how many of you know what design tokens are? Wow, all right, I'm gonna boot through that first part of primers, primarily for the people in the future watching this recording. Can we give a round of applause for everybody who's working on the Smashing team and in-house right now who's making that possible? Yeah, you've had a ton of technical content today. I expect you to remember almost nothing from my talk, which is why I decided to, okay, who was really hoping for something super technical at the end of the conference? You will be disappointed, I'm very sorry. I have spent most of my career working as a design systems team of one in very small startups that you've probably never heard of, so much so that I thought I was going to put some cool logo montage of everywhere I worked and you'd recognize only the one, so that was not an option for me either. My talk today is called Bridging the Gap One Token at a Time, but it's not really a talk about design tokens. It's actually a story of a series of failures I had when I first started working with Token Studio, and how that made me realize that I was a naive, inconsiderate, self-centered designer with unrealistic expectations who was actually contributing to this idea of the gap. So for all my neuro-spicy friends out there, the plan for today is to cover those primers. I'm going to talk about my past fails and those realizations I had through that process. I'm going to touch a little bit on my present workflow and the strategies, and then, if we have time, fingers crossed, I'm going to share with you some of the new future-friendly solutions that the Token Studio team is working on to help this idea of bridging the gap. Now, what is the gap? I thought I would show you instead of telling you. This is a viral video that went around last year of a designer singing something about sunshine, making this toggle button, and the programmer furiously trying to keep up. All right, I think we've looped it. Now, another way to put this is it's the difference between the expectations and the reality. I borrowed this photo from Netflix's baking show called Nailed It. Okay, you have to try to bake the thing that's, the good-looking one on this side of the screen. And the guy actually won $10K for making that one, so sometimes it's okay if there's a bit of a gap between the expectations and the reality. Now, in researching for this talk about bridging the gap, I wanted to make sure that the things that I had experienced, primarily as a design systems team of one for most of my career, actually translated to everyone else who had a whole bunch of different experience. And so I went to the socials, and there was a lot of talk about it, and turns out we're all experiencing the same thing with the gap, regardless of what size of company you work at. If you're curious, you could click that QR code. It will bring you to the thread. Feel free to contribute. I will publish a blog on the research after, but I'll save you all of that reading. The TLDR of it is we really just need to meet people where they're at. Because the gap happens when we don't understand how people are working or what they need or what their limitations are. And the gap is actually a cross-functional team problem, because when you have this idea of the gap, maybe it's between design and development, I hate that, but everybody feels it, right? It's expensive. Marketing can't figure out when can they promote the new feature you were supposed to release because it wasn't released on time. Or you spend a tremendous amount of time in QA holding your engineers hostage to something that you've claimed in Figma should work exactly the way that you've designed it. So I'm going to tell a little story about the first time I became aware of the gap. That SOS symbol is not there for me to be dramatic, although I wouldn't put that past me. I actually had to redesign the SOS experience for a satellite telecom company. And I still get a little bit of PTSD every time someone says to me, oh, it's just a button, we're not saving lives here, because like it's just a button until it's the SOS button. And I spent 6 months on this project, researching it, testing as best you can when it's this sort of thing, handed it over to the engineers who were offshore, and I said handing over on purpose there for anyone paying attention. And it took them another 6 months to get this thing out the door. Why? Because they couldn't figure out how to build all the custom components that were in my beautifully documented, over-communicated Figma file. And the QA engineers were holding them hostage to what was in the design file. And when it finally shipped, this guy over here is going to represent my PM, my product person, my product manager, my product designer, whatever you want to call them. By the way, this whole talk is done in the series of low-budget graphic novel that I built with Bitmoji, so if you're a big comic book fan and I've offended you, I'm really sorry. This will be me, this will be my PM, and we couldn't believe how long it was taking, and I'm like, I don't know what to do the next time. Marketing couldn't figure out when we were going to talk about the thing. They didn't know when to pass it to PR. We didn't know how long the problems that we were going to having were going to persist, and that's pretty important when you're dealing with something like SOS. And this problem of the gap that we were facing got so big that on the next project, when we were dealing with a redesign of the brand, because we had a big accessibility problem, as you can see, we actually couldn't trust, like, how long is this going to take? Are we even going to be able to get this thing out the door? And the PM kept saying to me, like, how are we going to bridge the gap this time? Because what's been happening is not okay. So as I'm collaborating with the marketing team and I'm going to all sorts of online conferences and I'm trying to figure out, like, how can I bridge the gap? I heard about this tokens thing. And my team thought it was a really great idea, except for at that time, it had just been released. There was no design or documentation, only some GitHub page with some scant notes on it. And we couldn't trust the engineers offshore to do this. And so we decided that we were going to hire an agency to do a proof of concept with us. And we were going to start to use this thing at that time, which was called Figma tokens. And this guy is going to represent the engineer from the agency for the rest of my story. Now, if you see Figma tokens or Token Studio in any of these logos, it's the same thing. Like any good startup, there's been a little bit of an identity crisis, and a few come to, whatever moments and figuring out who we are, and so, they're all the same through the versions of this story. But the idea was that I, as the designer, could be working in Figma, doing my thing, and somehow magically get the engineer code that they could actually use in code, and I didn't have to learn to code. Sounded pretty good to me. Engineers get the code, and they can use this thing called Style Dictionary and put it into whatever programming needs that they really wanted. So this sounded pretty awesome as a way of bridging a gap with a shared source of truth. Now, I know most of you know what a design token is, but for our friends in the future on the interweb, a design token is a way for us to capture all the important things about a design decision in a little packet of information. So who, what, where, when, why, and how of this decision goes in this tiny little thing called a token. Now, technically speaking, the design token expresses a design decision in a common language that's platform agnostic and shareable across different tools, disciplines, and technologies. So when you hear people confuse a variable with a token, a variable is not a token. A variable is a way of expressing a token, which is a way of expressing a design decision. Just like that design decision or that token could be a style in Figma, a raw value somewhere else, or maybe even in PenPot or some other tool that somebody else on our team wants to use. And the common language, the JSON files where the token lives, is managed by the Design Tokens community group who are trying to get a spec going, which is currently open source. If anyone feels passionate about this, please get in there and share your ideas, because we would love to move this thing along. The mandatory requirements today for a design token is that it has a name, a value, a type, and a description. And that token must live in a JSON file written in a particular way. Now, trigger warning for designers, tiny bit of code coming up. It's not going to be like what you experienced first thing this morning. If you were here, I also was overwhelmed. The anatomy of a token looks like this. So in this example, we have the token, which has a name. So it's colors green 500, or I've created a new token called success on hover, and it's referencing that green token 500, and the name is the ID of the design decision. The value is what we decided, and here you can see at the bottom one, I'm referencing that green 500 from the top, right? So you can recycle these things. The type tells the computer or the machine or the engineer exactly what they're supposed to do with this value, kind of important. And optionally, we can write a little note in there in the description that helps people understand maybe how or why we made this decision. And Token Studio, or Figma Tokens, if you're not familiar, is a tool, and today it's a suite of tools, actually, that designers can use to capture all of that information in a no-code wrapper. So I can be in Figma, open a little plugin, fill in some information, apply the tokens to my design, and then engineers can actually look at the designs, see that they're there, and I can actually push those tokens right to GitHub from within Figma without ever leaving Figma. Okay, primers are done. Thank you all for making it through that part. This next part is where I realize that I'm the worst person ever, and I'm very sorry to every engineer I worked with up until this point in my career. The redesign project started with a Slack message from my product person. Hey, Sam, here's a PowerPoint mock-up I did of the new billing page. Can you get it ready for dev by end of day? Oh, and try not to change too much because it's going to be weeks before we get sign off on those changes. Okay, thanks, bye. Anyone else ever start a project with a message that had PowerPoint in it as a designer? Yeah, did you feel like this? But of course, you say, yeah, no problem. And I'm in Figma, and I'm painfully copying like a PDF of a PowerPoint presentation. And the whole time I'm just thinking, like, this would be so much easier for me if I could just get them to come into Figma and use my tools. Like, maybe I'll make this design system so good that the PMs will want to come in and use it. That'd be great. I finish it up, and I fire it over to my new dev friend at the agency. Hey, I've got John's PowerPoint thing ready for you. And what felt like 3 seconds later, I get a message that says, yeah, this is not how it works in code. And every designer who's had that message feels like this. But it's a new team, and the agency is supposed to be helping me make my life easier as well. And so I say, like, hey, can you maybe show me what you mean? I'd really benefit from understanding, because truthfully, I have no idea what you're talking about. And we get in Figma, and I'm watching him try to click through these layers, and he keeps missing it. And I'm like, no, you gotta double click. And like, oh, if you command click, you'll get right into the bottom one. I'm like, I don't know, that's not where the text layer even is. And I'm thinking as he's struggling, like, oh, the UX for an engineer in a Figma file on inspect is brutal. Like, it's almost as brutal as this morning when I had to try to do this from a PowerPoint. And I realized in that moment that my lack of empathy was actually a big part of this gap problem that we'd been having. And I was like, wow. How had I never considered my engineers, my developers, as a part of the user of this product that I was creating? Speakers dinners, talks with attendees, engineers will talk and they're like, oh, consider the end user. And I always ask, like, who do you consider as the end user? The person using the thing. And in design systems, if I try to take a UX approach, I'm making a product, which is a bunch of buttons and stuff in Figma, and anyone who's touching that is actually a user of the product. But how had I never considered that my engineers might be a part of that crew of people? And in fact, I often would sacrifice the way that components work because I'd be favoring product designers over engineers, just, less than ideal. Anyways, back to my horror story where I'm in Figma watching this person go layer by layer, and at this point I've looked at so much code that I'm almost having like a visceral allergic reaction to CSS. And I'm like, how can I make your life easier at handover? And he's like, get me out of Figma. Like, I really don't want to do this inspecting thing anymore. And I was like, okay, well, let me show you what I did. I just go into this little panel, and I click these 2 buttons. And this one here is for the monospaced numbers. And this one over here is where I did that /0. So surely, if I can do it in Figma, you must be able to do it in code. He opens up the Chrome browser and shows me the font family that marketing has sent over to me to use, which, by the way, I can't change because it'll be weeks before we get this sign-off on that. And he's like, well, no, I can't magically make that 0 a slash glyph. It's not how it works. Your glyph is not slashed. I can't just make that happen. And if you want to monospace something, you should probably choose something that's supported by monospace. Second realization, oh, you mean just because I can do it in Figma doesn't mean that I should? And then I realized that I actually have this knowledge gap. And I have no idea, or I feel like I have no idea how anything actually works in code. And so I very sheepishly say to this engineer, like, where can I look at some resources? Because if we're going to start this whole tokens thing, which is new to everybody on the planet really at that point, how do I do a better job? Like, how do I make your experience better? What can I do? And he says something like, oh, well, we're going to code it in React, but your native apps are going to be different. So, like, maybe just write them in line with CSS, and then, like, ping me when you need some help. Like, someone who doesn't know how to code, I don't even know if that was actually what he said, but it sounds good in the slide. So we'll just leave the story at that. And then it hit me. Up until this point in my career, I had successfully avoided learning basic code despite having 2 university degrees and working in this field for 6 years. But somehow I expected engineers to come into Figma and use Figma as the source of truth. But I've just now realized that Figma is magic, and I can just make things happen that are not even feasible to be built in code. And how can I be holding engineers accountable for that if I don't actually know how things work? So the naive designer is also a problem of the gap. And as we started working on the tokens thing, and by the way, please do not screenshot this as the way you should do stuff. This is a part of the fail. There are better ways to do this. I'm like, oh, they're ready, first ones. And my engineer says, like, let me know when they're in GitHub. And I have coined this term called GitHub face. Feel free to borrow that term. Anytime you ask a designer to do anything in GitHub, they'll do this. Oh, and I told them, like, well, okay, I'll try, but I'm going to be lost. And my engineer can see me spiraling, and he does this really beautiful thing. He reframes it for me. It's just where we're going to store those token files outside of Figma, because as we've just realized, Figma's not a great source of truth. And don't worry, I'm going to help you. But what if I totally mess it up? Nah, there's nothing you can do that I can't help you roll back because we're going to version control it. I don't even know what that word means at this point in my life, but that's all right. He helps me get the GitHub sync set up, and of course, I'm just in Figma doing my thing furiously, and this magic thing starts happening. We're all of a sudden speaking the same language, but I don't know how to speak his language, and he's not coming into Figma as much. And I was able to meet my engineers where they were at, which is in code, but in a way that felt safe to me and the tools I was comfortable in. And the gap was shrinking. The designs were coming out consistent. If you're not familiar with what this looks like as a designer, this is my Figma design, and this was the screen share of the local host. And please don't get caught up about the fact that the colors don't exactly match. It's a screen share. Let's not get caught up in the semantics of it, but it was pretty accurate, like the most I had seen out of a process so far in my career. And everything was going amazing until my first breaking change. I also didn't know what that term meant. So the engineer comes into work in the morning, and I'm sure he spat his coffee all over his computer screen, and I get a message that says, hey, Sam, you free for a quick sync? Okay, if you're a designer first thing in the morning and you receive a message like that from your engineer, it's not good news, so you make the giant cup of coffee. And he says, like, yesterday this was working fine, do you remember? And then I start thinking to myself, okay, there was a time change, you got off work at 1, what did I do? Oh yeah, I read this article on how to name tokens by this really important person, and I might have went in there and started changing the names of some things because I realized that I had done everything wrong. And he says, like, well, you can't do that. You can't just go in and change the names and stuff I've already been working at. That's a breaking change. And I'm thinking, like, I thought naming stuff was a complete waste of time. You know, designers like, oh, you don't need to name your layers. Like, I'm sorry, you think naming layers is hard? Try naming tokens, especially ones that are already being used in code. You're locked in forever. No, just kidding, but almost. And I am spiraling and feeling like a terrible person and apologizing profusely and thinking like the end is over, because if you're a designer in Figma, your options to roll things back safely and figure out where you went wrong are almost impossible. So that's what I'm thinking this is. And he's like, no, we're going to go look in the version control together. It's fine. And he gets me to screen share my GitHub account, and he shows me the screen, and I'm like, what are all those green dots? Well, that's all the code that you've been pushing to me. And some other screen where it's literally like, oh, what's 3,000? Like, yeah, you wrote 3,000 lines of code and you committed it to main like a maniac. What were you thinking? Well, I thought I was working the branch. I guess I don't really know how to double check that in the plugin. And how can we make sure this doesn't happen again? And I had my next big realization, which is when you're working with tokens, you're writing actual code that's being used in code. The name of the token is actually what the engineers are using to call the values. It's the ID of the design decision. It's very important. Okay, I need to take my work more seriously. I need to take accountability for my role on this team. And my role on a design systems team or any systems team, as much as designers don't want to admit it, is to make your engineers' lives a little easier. But you still have to capture the future-friendly design decisions for your scaling organization. And you also have to create assets that can be shared across the cross-functional teams that need to use them in the tools of their choice, because I decided in this moment that asking PMs, stakeholders, marketing teams, and everyone else who wasn't a designer to come into Figma all the time to leave feedback or try to use my components and my tools was painful. Almost as painful as me having to learn, you know, the GitHub thing. But I was very well supported. So in summary, I need to learn to be a better teammate, and I really need to meet people where they're at. And I had this massive realization that the willingness to learn is actually how you bridge the gap. And designers by default are type A and a little bit perfectionist and kind of want to think that they know everything. But admitting that I didn't know what I didn't know and asking for help and resources that were given to me from the engineers actually brought us closer together. All right, that's the end of the failure part. This next section is my current workflow, because this is the thing that everybody, like, okay, it's cool, like, how do you do it? So the expectation, remember the gap, expectations versus reality. The gap is that I feel like a Jedi, and I know exactly what I'm doing, and I can teach you the ways, and you can copy it, and your gap is going to go away, and you'll be a token master. The reality is that the process makes me feel kind of like I'm sitting in a bowl of poutine. If you're not familiar, I'm from Canada. I live in Toronto, where poutine was not invented far away. It's French fries and cheese and gravy. And sometimes you think it's going to be amazing, and other times the cheese curds are not curds. They're just tiny little squares of mozzarella, and the gravy's not hot enough to melt the cheese, but somehow you eat the fries and you're full, and it all works out in the end. Thank you. Appreciate you. Okay, first part of the process is still that creative chaos in Figma. I still do all of those things. I still make all those magic switches and buttons happen. It's funny because one of the founders of Token Studio, his name is Jan Six. You may have, if you're into tokens, you've probably heard something by Jan in the past. He is still currently a product designer at GitHub, actually. And when I was talking to the team about this talk, he said, you know, those things that you can do in Figma, which are like a little bit of magic, are actually not all bad, because if you don't know how code works, it allows you to very quickly get this idea out of what you're trying to conceptualize. The problem becomes when you leave it until way too late to bring in engineers, where they tell you, like, yeah, actually, that slash glyph is magic, and we have to make better choices before you get sign-off. Like, you know, we can't think about what we do in Figma, this creative chaos, as what we have to hold everybody else accountable to. So then I researched some CSS resources. And if you are an engineer and you work with designers, please share with them resources where they can learn and show them how things work. It is super, super, super helpful to learn in a visual way. At the end, I'm going to share my bento link. I have an Airtable database, one for learning resources for code, for designers. I've actually had some help from some of the very impressive people on this lineup to fill in that table. So after I research the CSS, I battle imposter syndrome and realize I have no idea how anything works, and I contemplate how I've gotten this far in my career, and yet I'm still here with all of you, so apparently I'm not all bad. And then I go and I make changes, and I refactor all of that creative chaos into something that is more closely in line with code to make my engineers happy, trying not to sacrifice too much of the product designer experience. And then I invite engineers and product people into that file, and we collaborate. Now, if I'm working with product people who are less sophisticated in Figma, we agree with engineers that we can make some sacrifices. That stuff happens. Then we make more changes based on the feedback from that collaboration session. And then, very important for anyone starting in on their tokens journey, and even today, I still work in my own safe space. I have my own GitHub repositories. I have my own files. I am free to do all the breaking name changes that I want. And then when I'm ready, I collaborate with engineering, like, hey, what branch do you want me to push it to? And, you know, are you guys ready for that? And, you know, and we can do it together. We collaborate on that sync process to the code repository. I do the push, and I pray that nothing breaks. Most of the time, it does not break these days, which is great. And then I do the documentation and the cross-functional communication. And some teams like it in Figma. Actually, the engineers kind of like when you have some docs in Figma so they can be in there, but they don't have to do that stupid inspect layer by layer thing. Talk to marketing and product and everyone else who needs to know what's happening. And then I collab with engineering team again, because by this point, they're actually using those tokens in code. And that's when I realize I've made another series of mistakes, and I need to do a bit more refactoring. And then at some point, I repeat one of those processes depending on how that thing goes, but at the end of the day, I ate the poutine. It felt great. So in summary, taking a UX approach to my work and creating some sort of collaborative process and inviting people into the file often is pretty important, but also I've changed my position as Figma as the source of truth that everything should be held against, and I have a looser interpretation of that. And I would love to tell you that there's one magic tool or one magic process that's going to help you bridge this gap. It's just simply not true. But I can, with some level of confidence, tell you that if you collaborate with your team, that gap's going to get smaller because you're going to have empathy for each other and you're going to be able to meet each other where they're at. All right, last section. I'm doing pretty good on time, so hopefully this goes well. So I work with Token Studio, and Token Studio has been thinking a lot about this problem of where do we meet people where they're at? What does the future look like for that? Because today, I can work in Figma and I can meet my engineers where they're at. But what about all the other people on my team? How do I meet them where they're at? In fact, working in a plugin is something I'd rather not do in general. So in Figma, product designers maybe don't want to work in a plugin either. So this video is me on a slide you just saw. I have some tokens there, and they're applied. I'm exporting them as variables in Figma. they're there. You can see they've been created. This is real time, not sped up, of course. Now I'm going to take those tokens that have been applied, which were raw values. I'm going to quickly flip them over to my new variables, and now I can theme switch between light and dark using Figma's native variable feature. So product designers don't actually even need to work in a plugin, which is pretty cool. Unfortunately, in Figma, I still have to work in the plugin, but there are other tools on the market that have thought about this a little differently. So our friends at PenPot are here. And PenPot, what I'm really excited about is they're trying to take all these things that are super magic elsewhere and trying to make them a little less magic in the design tool, but without taking away the fun of working. And so what you're seeing here, you guys are the first group of humans outside of the Token Studio or the PenPot team who are seeing theme switching with native tokens in PenPot. So this is not a plugin. This is not some variable pretending to be a token. These are actual native tokens working in PenPot, and we're theme switching between light and dark. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Also, you've heard the rumors that there might be like some CSS-like things in PenPot. That's true. So auto layout is out, and Flexbox and Grid are in, which is super exciting. Okay, true story. My then 9-year-old stepdaughter was learning to code in Scratch, and I was struggling to wrap my head around new auto layout features, and she said, "Oh, it's just like Flexbox. Do you want to try my Flexbox Froggy tool?" Is that a joke? No, it actually did help me learn because, you know, kids can code and I can't auto layout. And working directly in the tools to do this manual sort of process with the tokens is probably fine if your design decisions or your token structure map looks something like this. You might have a couple of brands, you might have a light or dark theme. That's cool. But as you scale, your system starts to look more like this diamond shape over here. Okay, I have multiple brands. They all have their own typography. They all have their own colors, the assets that are different. They all have a light and a dark theme, and they also have a high contrast theme, but that's actually a theme within a theme. And I have platform requirements which change. Maybe my brand changes on a different TV or a tablet or whatever. And then, and it gets out of control. So Token Studio has now in alpha this standalone platform, which you can access currently through the web browser, and you can manage all of your design tokens in a way that allows you to see where they're at, make changes, and this syncs directly with your design tools, as well as to your external storage providers, GitHub, whatever you might like. Now, speaking of tools, my product people still don't care about this standalone platform or PenPot or Figma, right? They'd really rather not work in those tools in general. So what about my friends who work in print? My marketing team is going to do a conference, and we want all this amazing printed stuff. Okay, what you're seeing here is tokens being pulled into InDesign and theme switching in InDesign from those same tokens that you saw from the standalone platform. So we're now able to meet my marketing team and my print designer in the tools where they are at. And the one I love to hate on so much, this is PowerPoint, if you're lucky enough to not know. Sorry it's not in the brand colors, but they did a breaking change and couldn't get me the right video, but I thought this was impressive to show anyways. We're still theme switching with tokens right in PowerPoint. So my executives, my PMs, my researchers, anyone else who's faster in another tool can use my same design decisions there. And if that wasn't the most impressive part, tokens are still a pretty manual process. We're still capturing a design decision one at a time. Maybe you can do some duplication magic. But Token Studio has launched this thing that we're loosely calling right now the graph engine. Has anyone heard of this before? Anyone know what I'm talking about? Okay, one person, great. Well, you don't count, PenPot. This is a sped up version because it does take a little bit of time. But the graph engine is a node-based. That was dramatic effect. It's a node-based tool. So what we're doing here is we're actually creating those color scales based on algorithmic design. So what's my base hue? How many steps do I want? What is my contrast requirements? If I change something, everything else matches because I want to make sure that when I'm combining these different colors together, I still have sufficient contrast ratio. This graph, this whole section of nodes, which are just collections of tokens in a little box, can be packaged up into a bigger graph and recycled, reused, shared, moved across different tools and technologies. It can output tokens, and this is just one of, like, I don't know, 500 nodes that they've built so far. So today we have tokens, and tomorrow we'll have algorithmic-based design. That's the end of my talk. 15 seconds under my time. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Engineers, if you go to that bento link and you see that code for designers thing, there is a way for you to contribute. So if you're like, ooh, if my designer asked me where they should go to learn, I know exactly what I'd put in there. Please help them, because this is something we can share.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sam. That's incredible. Actually, the first time I saw this graph of tokens, I thought that this is really magical, because once you kind of, one thing is to just decide, okay, this is the color, this is how we call the color, this is what the color is going to be. This is the type, and stuff like that. But then once you start thinking about how those tokens are connected, and how they should change based on so many things, from dark theme, light theme, and whatnot, whatever else is coming up, this is really becoming kind of almost like a different layer, I guess, when we're abstracting away from where we currently are, but then really thinking about this relationship between tokens, and almost like architecting those tokens more than just defining them.
Yeah.
Just really fascinating.
I think about it like if I had to document every thought I had along the way of building a brand palette manually, it would take forever. But this is, once I get it done, I can just switch the hue and it recycles over. So
yeah, and you can just reuse it, especially if you're dealing with something like multi-brand, multi-theme. This is
impressive. And they're actually building like a sharing platform. So if you have a cool structure that you want to share with me or vice versa, we can actually do that.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
One note came quite away, and I think I can only confirm that. So there is one person writing, your level of ability to be self-critical is inspiring. I wish anyone could have a bit more of this. Thank you, with the clap emoji.
Oh, thank you. It's a risk to stand on stage for 30 minutes and roast yourself when you know the DJ is taking clips of you roasting yourself to remix into a techno track.
This is going to stay forever.
Yeah, I'm excited about it.
Yeah. Marcus is asking, are there token approaches for micro-animation or other dynamic behavior? That's usually our biggest gap from design to development.
Yeah. So there are now in the W3C specifications a specification for animation tokens, which means the tools that support tokens are going to start to be able to produce those tokens to the spec, which is fascinating. But you can already capture those decisions in the graph engine, which is also open source. So if you are inspired and you want to contribute, let us know.
Fantastic. One question that came up also quickly. So once you realize that you actually need to change design tokens after all, how do you do that then exactly?
Yeah.
Do you coordinate it with the developers? Do you set up like a workshop, or do you just do it?
Version control is a magical thing. It's a magical thing. It just automatically captures the changes you made. So you just go into the plugin and you change the tokens and you push the change and you write your note and you pray that nothing is super broken, and then you collaborate with an engineer when you did break it, because you will, and they help you fix it.
All right. Coming back to a wonderful joke about naming convention. Okay, like free laughs. Fantastic. Lucy is wondering, so do you have a great naming convention system?
I did just teach a workshop on naming tokens. I have a free FigJam file that you can DIY to create your own templates in collaboration with your engineers, because you're writing those for them, remember? However, maybe I'll do a workshop with Smashing one time on naming tokens. That'd be fun.
If you want, you can also show it, because I know this is, probably like a whole talk on that.
Yeah.
But, just so the link, so people can actually follow along. You're just going to post it maybe later.
I will post it. I'll post it everywhere. Yeah.
All right.
Also, like if you go to that bento link, all the stuff is there.
So another question, what are some of the red flags that you would recommend to avoid when you define design tokens? Maybe that you see other designers do.
Not talking to your engineers or thinking that you're writing them for other designers. It's pretty important. Writing them all the same. So like I showed that map of the token structure. Those are all individual sections of information that has to flow through itself. And so if my future self or someone else is looking at a token and they're like, where does this live in the structure? Why do all the color tokens start with color? That's not helpful. I don't know where to go and look for this thing. Like, how can you change it a little bit so you know where it lives in your architecture and you can go find it easily and you can pinpoint where you need to make some changes or where things live?
I think that many of us are also kind of, I think that many years ago we started looking at, okay, what are the style guides and design systems? So I kind of ended up designing or building design systems. And I think that also, as we keep going, it seems like we move or shift our efforts sometimes, where we have maybe many different design systems and kind of maintained by different product teams or verticals in different companies. And then there is this big question, how do we merge or kind of somehow bring together those design systems, but also with them, of course, design tokens. So how would that work? Do you have a debate and decide on the naming convention, or how would this process look like of migrating them or merging them?
Okay, controversial conversation. Component tokens are your friend there. Because you can have component-specific tokens attached to a single component library that give no hints about what the values are. And then the values of those tokens can point to which brand, which product, which theme, which application, whatever it is. And then you can just change which theme is applied to that one set of components. So you can have a product design done of a screen, and you can say, okay, today I want it to be styled like PenPot instead of Token Studio, and you can flip that switch and you can see it, and those changes would roll through. So component-specific tokens allow you to do that.
One question that came up, I think, on Slack. When did you use Figma variables? When do you define the decisions as design tokens?
I personally don't use variables because I'm living in token land forever. But anybody on my team who wants to use variables, because that's a great experience for them and they don't want to be in the plugin, that's when I would make a duplicate of my tokens, export them as variables. They're still attached to my tokens. And then they can do theme switching or whatever they want. But not everybody can live within this, 4-mode limit. It's not feasible for everybody. So if your system needs are growing past variables, then they're no longer a contender for you.
Got it. All right. Sasha is wondering, we've been talking about designers that code and coders that design for what feels like ages. Do you feel we still missed the opportunity to integrate this natively somehow into how we educate junior designers and developers? What do we need to do better so we don't continue having this argument over and over and over again?
I think everybody that codes doesn't code the same language or even the same part of a product. So not everybody has to do everything. But when you think about a designer, where do they get to go to learn? So like they've figured it out up until this point, and the chances of them working at a company where someone is a better designer than them and can teach them is usually pretty low when you're getting started. And we don't have this idea of open source projects that we can go to. If you're an engineer and you want to learn Rust, you can go and find an open source project. You can contribute to that. People are going to look at your code. They're going to give you feedback. Like designers don't really have that opportunity. So do designers need to code? Maybe not, but it would be great if they understood how code worked and that we would, as teams of people, engineers, PMs, whoever it is, like share what you know, help people learn, help them understand how things work, and maybe they want to do it. I mean, I've committed this year to write one thing in CSS, and I think I'm going to take one snippet from the first talk today and have that be the only thing I write all year and look like a rock star.
Absolutely, for sure.
It's my plan.
For sure. Now that you have 3 creative careers, what will be the 4th, do you think?
Is designing a spaceship a career? Could that be my next level up?
Sure.
All right, I'm going to go into spaceship design. That's going to be the one.
Is it like a thing?
I don't know.
I don't know.
You asked a hypothetical. I'm giving a hypothetical answer.
I
don't know.
But this is something that we kind of have to debate and figure out how we can move there. That would be exciting.
I want to learn to play piano
this
year.
I want it to be at least, working with NASA or something would be maybe nice.
Maybe. Oh,
Is
man.
that the design spaceship kind of career?
Maybe. I don't know. Maybe I'll just help NASA do something awesome, and then I can just like feel like I'm part of it without having to take all that stress. Because if I thought that was scary, could you imagine me working on space stuff? Oof.
Yeah, I mean, imagine you sending a token to space.
Imagine the spaceship is built with tokens.
I think there is no, like, sky's the limit at this point. This is it. All right, well, thanks.
Was
Thanks
that
so
a
much for being with us, Sam.